On the morning Elias Carter learned he was free, no one told him. There was no announcement, no cheering crowd, no paper placed in his trembling hands. The news arrived instead as a rumor, whispered by a Union soldier whose boots were caked in Virginia mud and whose eyes had seen too much death to care whether a single black man believed him or not. "Lincoln signed it," the soldier muttered, tightening the strap of his rifle. "Slavery's done. You're free now." Elias stood in the doorway of a half-burned tobacco barn, the smell of smoke still clinging to the wood. He was 32 years old. He had been enslaved since birth, and at that moment, freedom felt less like a door opening and more like the ground disappearing beneath his feet. Free to do what? Free to go where? Free to be killed by the same country that now claimed him? Across the fields, cannons thundered. America was tearing itself apart, and somehow it had decided Elias belonged to the future. Chapter 1. Chains Made of Paper. Elias had been born on the Carter plantation in Hanover County, Virginia, a coincidence of names that amused his owner and haunted him his entire life. The white Carters owned land, slaves, and history. Elias owned nothing but his breath and the quiet resistance he carried inside his chest. He learned early that silence was survival. He learned which overseers drank before beating men, which ones beat men sober. He learned how to lower his eyes without lowering his thoughts. He learned that Sundays were dangerous, not because of work, but because idle minds invited trouble. By the age of 12, Elias could read. That secret alone could have gotten him killed. Old Samuel, a broken man with fingers twisted from years of cotton picking, taught him letters by carving them into dirt behind the slave quarters at night. A Bible page, half burned, half stolen, served as their textbook. "Words," Samuel whispered once, "are chains too. Learn 'em, and one day you'll know how to break 'em." Elias didn't understand then, but he remembered. By 1861, the whispers had grown louder. States were leaving the Union. White men argued in town squares. Newspapers spoke of honor and rights and sovereignty, words that never seemed to include men like Elias. Then came the war. Confederate soldiers marched past the plantation in gray uniforms, laughing, singing, confident. They spoke of a short fight, of crushing the North, of keeping their way of life. Elias watched them go, knowing that their way of life was built on his back. When Union troops finally arrived years later, they did not come as saviors. They came as an army, hungry, suspicious, violent when afraid. Freedom did not arrive cleanly. It arrived soaked in blood and confusion, and it arrived too late for many. Chapter 2. A Country Divided, a Man Unclaimed. Philadelphia, 1863. Across the Mason-Dixon line, Thomas Hale read the Emancipation Proclamation under gaslight in his father's study. He was 19. His hands were ink-stained from law books, not gunpowder. His father, a respected judge, had argued that the Union must be preserved at all costs. "This," his father said, tapping the paper, "changes everything." Thomas wasn't sure if he meant morally or politically. Outside, the city buzzed with contradiction. Factories roared. Immigrants crowded streets. Black men celebrated cautiously, knowing paper promises had betrayed them before. Irish laborers cursed Lincoln, fearing freed slaves would take their jobs. America was fighting two wars, one on battlefields, another in its soul. 2 months later, Thomas enlisted. Not out of patriotism alone, but guilt. He had studied liberty in books while others bled for it. He could no longer pretend neutrality was virtue. By the time Thomas reached Virginia, he had learned how quickly ideals burned away under artillery fire. He saw boys die screaming for mothers who lived hundreds of miles away.
He saw officers freeze in terror. He saw courage and cruelty share the same uniform. And then he saw Elias Carter. Chapter 3. Under the Same Sky. They met near Petersburg during a chaotic retreat after a Confederate counterattack. Elias was running, not away from battle, but towards something he could not yet name. A Union officer shouted, a rifle cracked, dirt exploded near Elias's feet. Thomas tackled him instinctively, dragging him behind a fallen fence. "Are you trying to get killed?" Thomas yelled. Elias stared at him, really stared at the blue uniform, the pale face, the shaking hands that looked no different from his own. "I've been trying not to die my whole life. Today ain't special." Something shifted between them then. Not friendship, not trust, recognition. Within a week, Elias was working as a teamster for the Union Army, paid pennies, fed scraps, protected by no law but proximity. Freedom, it turned out, came with conditions. Thomas wrote letters home describing battles and boredom, never mentioning Elias by name. Elias listened at night as soldiers debated whether black men should fight, vote, live beside them. America had freed him. America still did not want him. Chapter 4. Fire After Freedom. When the war ended in 1865, church bells rang, cannons fired in celebration. The Union was preserved. But peace proved more dangerous than war. Reconstruction promised land, education, citizenship. What it delivered was backlash, night riders, burned schools, laws written to look fair and act cruel. Elias tried to vote once. He never tried again. Thomas returned north, carrying scars no one could see. He became a lawyer, then a politician, arguing for amendments and protections. He believed the law could finish what the war had started. Elias believed survival was victory enough. Their paths crossed again in 1871 in a courtroom where the future of Reconstruction was being quietly undone, one ruling at a time. Outside, a flag waved. Inside, America decided who it truly belonged to.
Chapter 5. The Long Shadow of Peace. Peace did not arrive in Virginia the way Elias Carter had imagined it might, softly, gently, like a dawn that erased the night. It arrived loud. Men who had hidden during the war now walked openly with rifles slung over their shoulders. Former Confederate officers returned home wearing civilian coats that failed to hide the authority still clinging to their posture. Old plantations were quiet, but the silence was watchful, calculating. Freedom had broken one chain. It had forged another. Elias settled near Richmond, working wherever work appeared, repairing rail lines, unloading riverboats, clearing rubble from burned buildings. He slept in shared rooms with other freedmen, listening to their stories in the dark. Some spoke of lost wives sold south, others of children taken before they could remember faces. Every story ended the same way. "We free now," someone would say, not quite believing it. Elias never said it. He had learned that words could be dangerous. Chapter 6. Laws Written in Ink, Enforced in Blood. In Washington, Thomas Hale sat beneath chandeliers debating the meaning of citizenship. The 14th Amendment passed with speeches about equality. The 15th followed with promises of the vote. Thomas believed, truly believed, that the law could reshape the nation if given enough time. He underestimated how patiently injustice could wait. Southern legislatures moved quickly. Poll taxes, literacy tests, vagrancy laws written vaguely enough to swallow any black man unlucky enough to be unemployed for a day. Sheriffs enforced them eagerly. Courts looked away. Thomas argued cases that should have been unwinnable and lost them anyway. The Constitution spoke clearly. The country did not listen. Chapter 7. Night Riders. The first time Elias heard hooves at night, he did not move.
He lay still, breath shallow, listening as riders passed the street below. No words were spoken, none were needed. The message was clear. Freedom had boundaries. By morning, a schoolhouse burned. A week later, a man Elias knew, quiet, careful, was found hanging from an oak tree by the river. No charges were filed, no investigation opened. Elias understood then what reconstruction truly meant. It was not a rebuilding, it was a test, and America was failing it. Chapter 8. Inheritance. Elias married late, too late, some said. He had learned not to trust permanence. His wife, Ruth, carried strength in her voice and exhaustion in her eyes. She had survived slavery by refusing to let it claim her children. Their son Daniel was born in 1872. Elias held him carefully, as if the world might demand him back. "This country," Elias whispered to the sleeping child, "ain't done deciding what you are." He prayed Daniel would live long enough to answer. Chapter 9. The Gilded Lie. By the 1890s, America glittered. Steel towers rose, railroads stitched the continent together. Newspapers celebrated progress, wealth concentrated in hands that never touched soil or sweat. Daniel Carter grew up watching trains pass, carrying futures that never stopped for him. He learned to read from old books his father kept hidden. He learned numbers working docks. He learned restraint watching his father swallow anger like medicine. Elias died in 1898, quietly, without ceremony. Daniel buried him beneath a simple marker. Born a slave, died a free man. The lie of that sentence haunted him. Chapter 10. Separate and Unequal. Plessy versus Ferguson reached Daniel not as a court decision, but as a sign nailed above a train station door. Colored waiting room. The law had spoken again. Daniel married, had children of his own. He worked harder than his father ever had, knowing effort did not equal safety. He taught his son Samuel how to lower his eyes and sharpen his mind at the same time. America marched forward. Daniel stayed in place. Chapter 11. A Different War. When World War I came, recruiters promised opportunity. Daniel's son Samuel believed them. He crossed an ocean wearing a uniform that marked him as American, even if his country rarely did. In France, under shell fire, race mattered less than survival. Men died equally. Samuel returned home decorated and was forced to the back of a bus. The uniform could not protect him. The country he fought for still debated his worth. Chapter 12. The Weight of Waiting. The Great Depression flattened everyone. For Black Americans, it merely deepened an already familiar hunger. Samuel worked when work appeared. He organized quietly. He listened to speeches about rights and labor and dignity. He began to believe that patience was no longer enough. Change, he realized, would not be granted. It would be taken. Chapter 13. A Voice Refuses Silence. Samuel's daughter, Lillian, grew up during World War II. She watched men leave and return. She watched factories hire women and then push them aside. She watched America preach freedom abroad while rationing it at home. When she heard Martin Luther King Jr. speak on a crackling radio, something inside her aligned. This was not anger. This was clarity. Chapter 14. Walking Forward. Lillian marched. She faced dogs, fire hoses, jail cells. She sang when fear demanded silence. She wrote letters to politicians who pretended not to read them. Some laws changed, many minds did not. But something irreversible had begun. Chapter 15. The Flag Still Waves. By the time Lillian's grandson stood beneath the same flag Elias Carter once feared, America had rewritten itself many times, not completely, not cleanly, but undeniably. The country was no longer asking whether he belonged, it was asking what it owed. The answer was unfinished. It always would be. Chapter 16. After the applause. The cameras left before the consequences arrived. When the Civil Rights Act passed, America congratulated itself. Politicians shook hands. Newspapers declared a new era. Lillian watched the celebrations from a small kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee. She had marched for this law. She had bled for it. And still she waited, because laws changed faster than lives. In southern towns, signs came down, but attitudes stayed nailed in place. Schools integrated on paper and segregated in practice. Employers hired black workers for positions without power, advancement, or security. Freedom had learned to whisper. Chapter 18. The War That Came Home. Vietnam did not feel distant to the Carter family. It arrived in draft notices and folded flags. Lillian's son, Marcus, was 19 when he left for Southeast Asia. He carried his mother's warnings and his father's silence. In the jungle, race blurred under mud and fear. Death was democratic. Back home, America fractured. Marcus returned to a country arguing with itself about the war, about authority, about what loyalty even meant anymore. He learned quickly that veterans were honored in speeches, not in hiring offices. Chapter 19. Order and Control. The 1970s brought a new language, law and order, tough on crime, personal responsibility. Marcus heard these phrases on television while watching police cars circle his neighborhood with growing frequency. Drugs flooded streets already starved of opportunity. Arrests replaced investment. Prisons expanded quietly. The system had evolved. It no longer needed chains. Chapter 20. A Different Kind of Cage. Aaron's mother kept old photographs in a box beneath her bed. Elias, Daniel, Samuel, Lillian, faces that looked forward even when the future refused to cooperate. Aaron studied them often, trying to understand how much endurance a person could inherit before it became a burden. He went to college, he studied law, he learned how systems defended themselves through language. He learned how to listen between the lines. Chapter 21. Names in the Street. The 2010s arrived with smartphones and hashtags. Names spread faster than justice ever had. Protests filled streets. Voices demanded accountability. Others demanded silence. Flags waved harder, as if movement itself were betrayal. Aaron marched, not out of rage, but obligation. He carried generations with him. Chapter 22. The Argument Continues. Courtrooms echoed with familiar debates: equality versus stability, rights versus order, progress versus tradition. Aaron argued cases his ancestors could not have imagined and faced resistance they would recognize immediately. America had changed.